So Glenn approached me and said, look, can you give a talk? And I said, fine. He said, can you just talk about the development of ICMM, as an external guidance and where that's gone with the industry? And so I thought about that for a couple of days and I said, well, there's a whole lot more than ICMM. There is a plethora of guidance out there where people, whether civil society, whether it's from the governments or from the other think tanks, are actually saying, how can we regulate the industry? And so I said, well, it's a little bit wider than that, so let me try and make a fist of working our way through it. So just a bit of an introduction. Really the business future of the resource sector and mining is really linked with that ability to be able to develop projects. And in this day and age, those project development has to meet the community's expectations. And there are a number of the major issues. The SD issues, as we call them, the environmental, the social impacts, they really need to be understood. And they can be a major challenge going forward for any new development. In order to do that, the planning is essential, and all those issues need to be identified, managed, and work through the whole life cycle of your project. And getting it wrong really impacts not only on the business, but on the ability of the whole resource sector then to develop other mines and new resource projects. And as I said before, there is a plethora of guidance and standards out there. So how do you navigate your way through that lot? Let's step back in time and why have we got all those standards and guidance there? And it's really about basically bad environmental performance. So you go back to how the industry was operating maybe 100 odd years ago, or it even dates back further than that. Back in, for example, there's mines in Spain where they've had acid mine drainage coming out the bottom of the adit into the rivers from Roman times. So that dates back 2,500 years. So things like acid mine drainage has been around for a long time. Are we any wiser? Do we manage it any better? We've still, in more recent times, there's lots of examples of acid mine drainage impacting on the environment, on the water systems. And again, communities and society don't like this. For example, in the States, there's many sites, Colorado, the Berkeley Pit, USA Superfund sites that are going to cost with perpetual ongoing billion-dollar cleanup. In Australia, probably the best known is Mount Morgan, just up here in North Queensland. And the overall global liability really does extend into the billions of dollars, and that will be a perpetual bill that society will have to pay going forward. There's been other mine failures and things like tailings facilities in Copper in the Philippines in 1996, and these are just some more recent ones, where about 3 million tonnes of tailings broke out of the bottom of a flooded pit and ended up going down the river, down the Boac River into the delta there. In Los Frailes in Spain, a lead zinc mine, a tailings dam wall let go, and about 5 million tonnes of tailings ended up down the river. More recently in Romania, there was that controversial cyanide spill to the river. So again, these are recent events. These only happened 3 or 4 years ago. So the industry isn't doing itself particularly good justice with these events, or 13 years ago, sorry. Recent, it's not only the mining industry. You look at the mud volcano caused by that gas welling in Indonesia. So what happened here? They were drilling for gas in Indonesia. All of a sudden, I think it was about 300 kilometres away, there was an earthquake, and all of a sudden this liquid mud started pouring up through the gas well. And that, they believe, they've tried to plug this liquid mud will keep on spewing out of there for another 30 years. And it's just encroaching the villages, their crops, their land, and no one can stop it. Who's responsible? Everyone says not me, but it's interesting that the actual resource companies that are actually doing the gas drilling have offered up compensation. So there's something like about 140 million being offered up as compensation to the villages. So they're saying we didn't do it, it's not our fault, however we are putting the compensation up. So, and again, even more recently in Hungary, there was 1 million tonnes of aluminium tailings that tailings dam broke. So it's no wonder that the industry, through its poor performance, is getting regulated. From a social point of view, probably the most controversial social unrest and closure of a mine happened just to the north of us at Bougainville Copper. And this happened in 1989. And Bougainville Copper was, it was owned by CRA, which was an offshoot of Rio Tinto at the time. It was generating about 20% of gross national product for PNG. And due to civil unrest, it closed in 1989 and ended up with a basically internal civil war there that's resulted in about 10,000 to 15,000 deaths, just through conflict between the various groups on Papua New Guinea. And the issue and the conflict was over, it's stated in the press and through dialogue that it was really over the environmental pollution. The waste, the tailings was pushed down the Java River and down into the delta. And that Java River built up around about 50 to 70 metres deeper with tailings. And so it was over the natural destruction. And the other major issue was, even though this mine was generating 20% of GDP, only about 1% of the royalties, or 1.5% of the royalties, was coming back to the provincial government for social programs. When I looked at this, and I was working in PNG at the time, what came quite clear is what I believe was part of the conflict was this whole intergenerational issue that we see with certainly in developing countries. So what's happened is the developers have come in, they've brokered a deal with the traditional owners, and after 10, 20, 30 odd years, the younger generation, the children who have come up, the sons and daughters of the traditional owners, have said, well, we're not really quite happy with the deal that you brokered back then with this company. We believe that we're being hard done by. And so you get this intergenerational conflict happening. And very much with Bougainville, I believe it was the younger blood coming through who then, the younger generation who said, look, we're not happy with this lot. We want to see more benefits flowing back to our province. Why haven't we got work? Why haven't we got business deals happening? Why can't we enjoy the wealth that this great mine is generating? And so that was part of the conflict that happened. And we see that in Papua New Guinea, the intergenerational issues around Porga, the younger generation have now, they're flexing their muscles, and certainly in the Octeti region as well. So it is an issue out there. And it's a really difficult one as a social practitioner on a mine or even for the government to actually address. So there's been undue pressure on resource companies, and that's, in standing back and looking at it, it's probably fair pressure. The public has increased that pressure to perform better in the SD arena. So they want to see improved environmental management. They don't want to see acid rock drainage running down the rivers or failure of the tailings facilities and other pollution. They want to see greater distribution of wealth back to impacted communities. So the wealth doesn't all end up in Port Moresby, for example, and none of it comes back to the province, or even here in Queensland. How much of our wealth ends up down here in Brisbane or in Canberra, and how much it actually flows back to the communities where it's generated. They want to see improved social benefits. So for the families living around the mines, they want to see, improved education, improved health, improved infrastructure, improved business opportunities. And also as part of that is improved transparency. Where do the dollars go? And I'll come to that a little bit later. And at the end of it, when the mine closes, is what's our sustainable future? If this mine's been running for 20 or 30 years, and it's generated billions of dollars of wealth, when it closes, what's our patch going to look like? Are we going to still be gainfully employed? Is there going to be business opportunities? Are we able to maintain that lifestyle that we've become accustomed to with good health services, etc., etc.? So stepping back from that and I suppose I got involved with this back in the late 1980s. It had come to a point with low commodity prices, and we're starting to see a low commodity price scenario here in Australia. You're looking at coal that's been some of the lowest, and there was a report on the ABC this morning as I drove in. Basically, they'd interviewed all of the coal mining companies on the east coast of Australia, and there are only 2 of them that are actually in the black. All the rest of them are losing money. So is that sustainable? It's not. And the reason a lot of them are running, they're locked in to supply coal across the port through the train lines to the port. And if they don't produce coal, they still got to pay that money. So again, you're going to see further rationalisation and price cutting in order these guys to get back in the black. So the mining industry globally has said, look, we're in pretty dire straits here. First of all, we've got a reputation problem. 2, our sustaining profits are being squeezed, and this is, this rings back to where we are today. You read in the press, you hear about it, you're in the industry. You can see this happening. We have problems of getting access to new assets. We're getting constrained, we can't do the exploration. You look at the coal seam gas, close the gate. The farmers don't necessarily want us on the land, being drilling on our land. So getting access to new assets is an issue. And that was eroding investor and employee confidence. And if you haven't got a happy set of employees, and they're also eroding confidence, then it's very hard to make the changes that you need in the business, your structural changes, in order to become profitable and move forward. So the mining industry said we need to look at this, we need to sort out how we can do this better. Coming up in a couple of years' time was the 2002 World Summit on Sustainable Development, and the resource sector was not going to actually be present there. They hadn't planned on being there. But these global leaders said, look, we need to be sitting around that table because this is now an emerging issue and we need to be there. So 9 of the key mining leaders realised the industry needed to reposition itself and took that forward. So what actually transgressed was what they called the Global Mining Initiative, the GMI. And a number of you may have heard of that. Have you heard of the Global Mining Initiative that was kicked off in around 2000? Anyway, what it was a major study to understand where is mining in relation to sustainable development. And so they put together a program. It ran for about 2 years. It was a research program looking around the world at countries where mining was at, looking at how mining, the companies and the countries actually interfaced and what were sustainable development outcomes. And that came out as a report, the Mining, Minerals and Sustainable Development Report. The MMSD was the program, and there were a number of Australians involved with that program. And the key findings were, and these aren't, there's nothing really untoward here, but basically it put the mining industry on notice, saying there is a lack of trust between the industry, governments and society at large. There is absence of a clear vision about the contribution which mining can make to sustainability. Confusion about boundaries of responsibilities, need to be able to translate sustainable development principles into operational standards so people on the ground can actually put it into practice. And we need benchmarks and KPIs for communities, consumers, companies and countries. So that report was published in 2002, and at that stage the ICMM, which is the International Council for Metal and Mining, and most of you will be familiar with that or have referenced their work, their mandate was to implement the findings of that report and be the advocate for mining globally. And the first output was the creation of the ICMM 10 principles, which most of you will be familiar with. And that basically became the foundation of the Sustainable Development Framework, and from there all their other work has flowed out from underneath that. And just quickly, those ICMM principles, and what I'm going to do is run through these, but then look at some of the other principles that are out there by other groups, and you'll see there's a lot of synergy between them. So implement and maintain ethical business practices and sound systems of governance. The second one is probably the most challenging. Integrate sustainable development considerations within the corporate decision-making process. So from your policy down through your standards, how do you integrate SD into your overall business making process? Uphold fundamental human rights and respect cultures. Implement risk management, and risk really underpins the whole of business across the world. It doesn't matter if you're looking at environmental, health and safety, engineering or sustainability. There is risk and there is issues there which need to be managed. Improve health and safety, improve environmental performance, contribute to the conservation of biodiversity, and integrated approaches to land use planning. So this is really looking at the conflict where can you move into sites where there's high value land or forestry. Facilitate and encourage responsible product design, the reuse, recycle, etc. Contribute to the social, economic and institutional development of the communities in which we operate, which is really underpinning where social practitioners and the sustainable development people are working, and how can we redistribute that wealth or take the wealth and then provide the services back, and implement transparent engagement, communication and reporting. So they were the 10 principles that basically the ICMM and the member companies at the time took on board. This is how we're going to run our business. And as I mentioned before, the MCA then took these principles and then unpacked them into a set of working. This is how, and guidance, and this is how, as a mine site operator, you can actually put this into practice. Today, the ICMM represents about 21 member companies, so it's really the big boys in town. There's about in those 21 companies, about 800,000 employees, operate 800 sites in 62 countries, etc., and has many associations with global groups. So they're dealing on a day-to-day basis with the UN, the World Bank, IFC, IUCN, EITI, etc. And one of the many things that they have developed is a number of great guidance volumes on how to implement this and how to interact to support those 10 principles. At the same time around this was happening in the early 2000s, there was the public sector response. There was increasing pressure on the governments and the regulators and certainly the financial institutions. Hey guys, the mining industry is, they're not performing how society expects, so what are you doing about it? And because the mining industry, whilst there was regulation in certain jurisdictions, there were other areas the regulation was not as strong. Certainly for the financial institutions like the World Bank and IFC, they've been lending money to countries to participate in mining. And the World Bank basically, and the UN is, their mandate is to reduce poverty. So if you've got a third world country that is relatively poor and they're resource endowed, then by developing their mining sector, you can potentially lift them up and reduce poverty overall, if you can get the wealth to flow back and circulate through the economy as it's supposed to. So the World Bank and the IFC were also under scrutiny because they've been funding these projects, and yet you'd seen no discernible improvement in environmental performance or social performance or indicators happening. So as part of that development, the World Bank put out its own set of environmental and social safeguard policies. Now under the World Bank there's a number of different investment entities. There's MEGA, which is the Multilateral Investment Guarantee Agency. There's the IFC, and another institution called ComDev. And ComDev is more of the implementation arm rather than the financial arm. It's interesting that only I think it was late last year or it's early this year, all of these agencies had either safeguard policies or standards, but they were not the same. They're all around the same sort of themes, but they're not all the same, and yet they're all under the same governance, I suppose, of the World Bank. So there's now actually a global review to actually, can we align all of these and have a standard set going forward? So the content wasn't the same. And the guidance and the standards are really to help the bank to reduce the risk in these key SD areas. And so that then they can line up, they can look at a new project coming to them and saying, does this project actually meet these criteria against our standards? And if it does, then we will provide financing for that. And ultimately, the World Bank is looking to reduce poverty reduction. For the IFC, and I've just taken one of these. The IFC are probably the most useful set. Certainly, when I've worked on developing EIAs and social environmental impact assessments in developing countries, in Africa, for example, we've had to write the SEIA to meet the IFC standards. So it's not to an Australian standard, specifically it's to the IFC standard. And so you need to deal with each of these areas in your SEIA. So they look at the assessment and management of environmental and social risks and impacts, labour and working conditions. The International Labour Organisation standards come into play here, the ILOs, resource efficiency, pollution, community health, safety and security. Land acquisition and involuntary resettlement is probably one of the biggest ones and the most challenging, certainly in developing countries, where invariably you end up with quite large resettlements of people. So doing that under the guidelines and also under the Human Rights Act can be particularly challenging going forward. Biodiversity, dealing with Indigenous peoples and cultural heritage. And there's lots of material out here. The standards are 50 pages and the guidance is 273 pages. So, there's lots of the consultants have written lots of words around this. One of the other sets of guidance that's out there and is the UN. And the UN Global Compact was created in 2000 and they invited companies to join. And to date there's about 10,000 companies that have actually joined the UN Global Compact as a voluntary process. And basically they've created 10 universally accepted principles in the areas of human rights, labour, environment, anti-corruption, etc. And their main mandate, which a number of you would have heard about, is to support the UN goals, including the Millennium Development Goals. So the Millennium Development Goals, very broadly, are down there on the bottom. They want to eradicate extreme poverty and hunger, universal primary education across the globe, gender equality, reduce child mortality, maternal health, combat AIDS and HIV, environmental sustainability and global partnerships. So again, you're seeing common themes running through from the World Bank, the UN, the ICMM, etc. going forward. Very quickly, the Global Compact has these 10 themes. You've got a couple of principles under human rights, under labour, under the environment, and then the anti-corruption side of things. At the same time, the banks were getting pressurised. You're lending money. So the banks said, we need a set of principles as well. So that when, as a mining company, you come to us, you want us to lend you some money, then we'll actually need to run the ruler across our set of principles. And I've been involved with these. Up at Lahire, we had loans with SocGen, Westpac, NAB, CBA, and every year they would come through with a due diligence team and we had to say, line up against their principles and say, do you actually meet these principles and guidelines? It's actually interesting, and it's probably the first time I've heard of it in Australia. I think it was Westpac or NAB refused to actually fund the wood chip facility in northern Tasmania based on the Equator Principles. It didn't actually tick their box, and that was so they do apply them, and they're quite rigorous in their reviews. The other initiative out there is the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, the EITI. And this is really about where does the money go. If we're resource companies and we're actually generating millions of dollars and it's going to the government in royalties, in taxes, etc., etc., we know how much we're pushing out through to the government. But then what happens to it after that? And so the EITI is really about, it's an initiative to get companies to publish what they pay and then for governments to be transparent on how much are they receiving and where is that money going. It has 7 key requirements, but it's been quite slow. The take up and by countries has been particularly onerous, and it seems to take about 4 or 5 years to actually sign on and then actually get yourself through the accreditation process. I apologise for the poor scan, but if you go on the EIT website, you'll be able to pick this up in the fact sheets, and I've got them with me here. But as you can see, in 2009 there were 2 compliant countries, and now in 2013, which is 4 years later, there's 23. The actual amount of funds that have been actually disclosed has risen from about 200 billion US to about $1 trillion. So there's been quite an exponential leap in the uptake of the EITI. You can see the countries here is very much dominated by the West African or East African countries, and you can see that there's a number of the major, the Western world, including Australia, who still haven't signed on, although Australia is actually undertaking a pilot study now as to sign up and see what the impacts will be of EITI. Some of the others that are out there and which are particularly pertinent to the resource sector is the voluntary principles on security and human rights. And this is really focused on the use of security forces, whether it's your own internal security force or if you're engaging the local police or the local security forces, and how they behave with those communities around where your project is. And these are UN endorsed guidelines. And recently I did some work for Xstrata up in the Philippines, developing a series of standards, a new policy and standards for the guys up there, and we rolled them out so they can be compliant with those voluntary principles. And this is a really, it's a hot issue. You hear about, violations across the world all the time where security forces of using mined vehicles to actually violate communities. So it is an issue and something that the resource sector takes very seriously. You have others like the International Cyanide Code, very specific to gold mining, but there is a whole raft of principles and standards which the gold companies sign on to, and they have to report against and get audited against. But there's still more. These are only some of them. And the other suite that's out there, which a number of companies have adopted, and in many cases they're being mandated by the suppliers. For example, most of the major copper miners, the actual purchasers of the copper, like Sumitomo Metals or Mitsubishi, they require that if you're a provider of copper, we want you to be ISO 14001 or ISO 9000. Things like, I think BHP is pretty well mandated that most of their sites will be ISO 14000. A lot of other people take them up as a voluntary approach. So again, there's a whole series of international standards out there. There's the quality, the environmental, health and safety. And there's a new guideline, the corporate social responsibility one, which I find is, it's not bad, but it's very much how you want to implement it. And there's a good little book out here. This one was put out by Greenleaf Publishing, and I'll leave a copy with Glenn if you like. This is a really good guide. If you are working in the CSR space, is how you can actually implement this with your company. And I've been using this, and I think I've got about 20 copies at home. I pass it out with workshops, so it's a good one. So lots of guidance, lots of regulations. In the resource sector, how do you get your head around this? How do you pull it all together? And then once you've got all that guidance, then it's a matter of how do you report against it. And again, there's a whole series of reporting criteria that have emerged through this process. Probably the most important one, and the one that most mining companies sign on to, is the Global Reporting Initiative. And these sustainability reporting guidelines are very complex. You've got, again, 266 pages of how do you report against all of these guidelines. They're common. You can pick it up. You can work out what level you want to be at. there's a whole, I suppose, a hierarchy of reporting starting from a C up to a B to an A+, which depends on your level of disclosure, if you're getting independent auditing, etc. And what you'll see at the back of most of the sustainability reports is there'll be whole sections on the GRI content and the cross-referencing against all of their indicators. So most of the major resource companies are signed on as part of their sustainability reporting. They've picked up on this. So what you see is in a report, there'll be a GRI content pages, and that may run to 3 or 4 pages, and then there'll be some form of assurance statement by independent auditors that yes, the content of this report and what is being disclosed is true and factual. So the real challenge going forward is, first of all, how do we get resource companies to commit to these initiatives? There are a lot of them out there, and they all have a cost. To take on each one of these, there will be a cost. It's a cost in the company's time, not only to adopt it, to actually embed it within their systems, but then for their people to run with it. If you've got reporting obligations, to put out a sustainability report, even for a company with 2 or 3 mines, is in the order of $250 to say $500,000 to actually do your sustainability reporting against all those criteria, get it endorsed and get it assured. So you really got to understand what is the business case, and each company's got to go through that process. Is there a business case? How can it improve the bottom line? If I take this on, how will it enable me to actually perform better? How will the company perform better? And how can it actually improve the share price, the returns, and also our sustainable development performance? The way most companies have tackled it is really embedding it through integrated management systems. So whilst there's many similar themes and issues by all these different sets of standards and guidelines, fundamentally, as you saw, there's some common themes. There's environmental themes, there's risk, there's human rights, there's disclosure, there's reporting. So you can actually take each of these initiatives, whether it's a World Bank or IFC or Global Compact or the voluntary principles of human rights, and line them up against your own set of standards. So you can create a set of policies and standards and say, if I have a standard on human rights, I can tick the box on voluntary principles, I can tick the Global Compact, I can tick the UN. So the smart operators, the guys that are doing this, have developed their own systems, and by running their systems and embedding their systems, they can then meet the obligations from these external providers that the companies have signed onto. You need to cross-map it so you can demonstrate that, and then you need to review and audit, which is standard processes. So what you're seeing now in the more mature companies are very much a well-evolved auditing and review processes through the sustainability group. So the environmental, the social guys, they are regularly getting audited, just like the financial accounts are. And ultimately, it requires strong leadership, and it needs leadership and commitment from the board and management to drive that process. As social practitioners or as sustainability practitioners, we can promote it from the bottom up, but it needs your upper level management. It needs the CEO, the board, the chairman of the board and your CEOs to be able to stand up and say, this is what we're going to do, this is how we believe in, and this is how we're going to run the company. So building an integrated system, this is just a model out there. It's typically here is a hierarchy of from a board, a CEO down through management. There will be a global. I'll just jump over here. You'll start with your policies. You'll have your standards, functional standards. These may be combined. Then you have operating procedures. And input to that, you've got all these external drivers like ICMM, Equator principles, etc., etc. And you've got internal drivers. And then ultimately through this, you need to encompass all of that, integrate it all, and then this drops out to actually having tools whether it's procedures, training packages, checklists, you've got various software, etc., to manage all of this so that your guys on the ground can actually embed it in their day-to-day activities. So it's not a bolt-on, it's actually just happens as a day-to-day, and people do it, and then there's obviously the reporting requirements.
Can I just ask, excuse me, is that your diagram or is that a standard one that's out there?
That's one of my diagrams, but that is reasonably standard. You could look at a management system there, and you take that hierarchy. If you go to any of the, even the ISO series and look at management systems, it's a similar sort of hierarchy.
Sorry, can you just get back and help me with some of the acronyms of the
Sorry, yeah. So this was your board, your chief executive officer reports to the board. You've got executive leadership team. So and then you've got your executive general managers. So this is for quite a complex company. So they've got, operations they had operations in Papua New Guinea, Australia, Africa. So they had, executives set up there, general managers, and then superintendents, etc., etc. So it's the hierarchical team managing the business in various jurisdictions. So don't get hung up on this. You don't have to follow this. This is probably way too complex. The less levels you can take out, usually the better your operation will be. So it all gets back to that social licence to operate. So ultimately what we're talking about is if I've got a well-run resource company, I've got a good sustainable development process, I've got good practices, I've got a good relationship with the community, with the government and with civil society, then I will have be able to maintain that social licence to operate. And so what we've seen over the years, the old approach was basically very much focused on environmental mitigation. It was let's do no harm. And you think back 20 or 30 years ago, sustainability as we know it and the social side was done, but it wasn't really talked about in these forums. You even look at the development of the CSRM here. That what's been around 10 years roughly. Prior to that, the focus was on environment. So your social licence was very much focused on environmental mitigation, and as I showed right at the start, quite frankly, the industry had a lot of room for improvement. We then started to think about development, and so there were a lot of cash handouts or cash contributions, a number of ad hoc philanthropy programs. We built a lot of schools, a lot of clinics, but they were great whilst the mine was operating, but at the end of it, what happened to those institutions? Was there money there to actually sustain them post the mine? International best practice, which is where most people are operating now, is you really got to get that strategic community investment in. You've got to do your social baselines, have a participative approach to it, community development plans, partnerships, and then communicate those results and have this interactive approach. So this is really where in the last since 2000 really, the last 13 to 15 years, the industry and civil society, the institutions like the World Bank and United Nations, this is where we believe that we will get a better operating system enabling this social licence to operate. So just going forward, the real challenges, it's really been able to maintain that social licence to operate. It's got to be an integrated part of the business and part of the culture of the company. It can't be just that add-on, this is the community team, they'll manage that. It really has to come from the board down and through senior management. They've got to own that process. It needs to be ingrained through our people and our business partners through that process, so with our own employees, but also who are our business partners, who are our suppliers. If we're using other contractors to do our earthworks or supply goods and services, it may be the catering company. How can they also be integrated into this process? We need to be able to quantify the sustainable value through the mine life cycle, and I haven't touched on it, but there are through ComDev, there's some really neat tools out there where you can actually do the sustainability economic analysis and look at the interventions that you put in place. So they are a great set of tools that were developed by ComDev, IFC and Rio Tinto about 3 or 4 years ago, and you can actually download those off the ComDev website now. So you need the metrics and tools so that you can actually understand and predict what is happening. You can track, is this working or is it not working? And have that discussion with your communities and with your community participation and also with the government saying, here is what our goal was, here's where we're trending and we're on track, or no, we're off track, so let's intervene and bring it back on track. You need to adopt the leading practices, and these are continually being improved and refined, so you need to be up to speed and on top of what's actually happening around the world. Well, who are the leading practitioners out there? What are they doing different to actually manage these issues? And ultimately, it's got to add value. If it's just going to end up as cost a whole lot of money and not add value, then certainly management won't be embracing those programs. And ultimately, when you close the mine, you need to be able to put something back. And this is an example from Ghana. We worked on this one, and this is old tailings dam, and basically we put it back to oil plantation. So that's now generating wealth for those communities through oil palm. Thank you.